Chapter 7. Adian. How to Ruin a Good Day. Adian awoke to the gentle caress of the sun's morning rays as they trickled through the side slats of the window shutters. He sat up, raised his arms above his head in a feline stretch, and released a contented sigh. He knew that he shouldn't, but still he lay back and rested his head once more on his plush pillow. He couldn't help but smile as he stared up at the wooden boards of the ceiling and thought of last night. He had already been proud of his previous day's actions before he had used that momentum in his sleep state to finally push into the next level. He was a level 24 field musician now, and the reassurance that came with the level up was as validating as ever. On top of that, as it so often did, sleep had brought clarity on what his immediate actions needed to be, and it was incredibly motivating to know that he once again had a figurative path to follow. He allowed himself to soak in the peace of the moment before he got up and kneeled down next to his bed. Thank you, Creator, for answering my prayers, for providing the clarity of this goal for me to work towards, and an affirmation of my path through a level up. You know how much I have struggled recently with my seeming lack of progress. I will use this as motivation to continue striving towards what you have laid on my heart. I also ask for your continued healing of the farmer and his wife. I ask that they will be brought back to full strength sooner than expected. I pray for Dre, that the class he chose last night will be fulfilling and useful. Give me discernment on the best way to invite him to join me. He paused as he grimaced, but eventually continued. Be with my family. Keep them safe. And finally, mighty Creator, please guide my steps today, that I may walk along the path that you have for me. Adian began to stand up, but then had a thought and quickly kneeled back down. Also, if it is in any way possible, please make the path easy today. As I'm sure you know, I could use a restful day to recover from yesterday. Adian got to his feet, quickly pulled on some clothes, and headed downstairs for some breakfast. The innkeeper thanked him for his performance the night before, and so did a few of the other patrons, who were mostly eating breakfast as well, except for a couple of men sitting at the bar who were already deep in the bottle. He sat at a corner table and ate the porridge he was served very quickly, in an effort to reduce the amount of time he had to pretend to enjoy it. He then moved to a bench outside and savored some honey-sweetened tea as he watched the sun slowly rise into the sky. Before he left, Adian ran back upstairs to his room and grabbed his flute. It was his go-to instrument to carry around. It was unobtrusive, light, and versatile as a weapon. It was inconvenient that the flute's inherent properties made it less than ideal to use as a conduit for his combat skills, but the instruments that were best for combat were far too cumbersome to walk around with. Adian returned downstairs, but waited to pass through the common room until Innkeeper Sorosa had entered the kitchen. He was in too good a mood to be bombarded with more requests to perform that evening. Once outside, he placed the flute in the specially designed pocket on the back of his jacket and headed towards the healer's house. He knocked when he arrived, but didn't hear any movement within, so he knocked again, waited, and then knocked again. Adian was just about to walk away when the door was opened to reveal an extremely grumpy-looking healer Noralee. She stood in the doorway and glared daggers up at him. I assume you have a good reason for disturbing the rest of someone who has spent the entire night tending to the wounds and comforting a couple of suffering people? Yeah, he replied, entirely unconvincingly. The old woman just stared at him, her facial muscles getting a full workout as her expression shifted from surprise to outrage and then exasperation. It eventually landed on a resigned weariness. What do you need this morning, young Adian? Adian's face had been slowly reddening in response to her reaction. He was starting to see the error in his ways, but he had already woken her, so he might as well carry on, right? Mostly, I just wanted to check in on Gladys and Tillman. How are they doing? The healer aggressively rolled her eyes, but she seemed to be holding back a smile as she said, Save a life and suddenly you think you know people well enough to be on an only-name basis? The healer raised an eyebrow before continuing. You are quite sincere, though, aren't you? Well, they are out of the woods, as they say. I expect them to make a full recovery. Adian let out a pent-up breath. Thank the Creator. That's great news. I know that you were confident when I left yesterday, but I couldn't help but worry. Those wounds were just so resistant to my healing song. Healer Noralee nodded. The disease nature and sheer volume of the wounds had me quite worried as well. Thankfully, none of the individual wounds were all that deep. I readily admit that I had expected their fevers to break earlier than they actually did. It ended up being sometime in the middle of the night. She shook her head as she continued. Whatever disease those creatures were carrying was magical in nature and potent at that. But as you say, thank the Creator that they are doing quite well, all things considered. Actually, Farmer Tillman has been asking about you quite insistently, but since he needs his rest, I won't allow you to speak with him today. I don't want him getting overexcited. Adian smiled to himself. He looked forward to meeting with the couple. His act of service had been only altruistic, but it was always nice to hear the gratitude of those he had helped. The honey in the tea, as it were. He shifted his mind back to the conversation after he noticed the healer beginning to look annoyed at him once again. I completely understand. I will return tomorrow to meet with him, if that is okay with you. As long as it isn't before midday, I suppose that is acceptable. I actually have a couple other questions, now that I think of it. Adian winced as the woman's expression soured further, but he spit out his words anyways. Do you happen to have any healing potions for sale? I wasn't sure if you sold those here or if I needed to visit the local alchemist shop. I had to use my only one yesterday after taking a nasty wound from a large corrupted cat. I try not to put myself in serious danger without a potion for emergencies. Healer Norley took a deep breath and released a long sigh. I don't have any for sale, although I do try to keep a couple in stock for my use on the most critical of patients. I'm not sure of how expensive healing potions are where you are from, but around here they are prohibitively so. Trust me, I know how expensive they are. I have enough money, though. And can you really put a price on a life? The healer's face hardened. Yes, you can, and I do, far more often than I would wish. Her eyes unfocused for a heartbeat, as if she was reliving every one of those terrible memories. There have been many times where I could have saved a life if I had chosen to liberally use my healing potions. I've chosen not to, because if used properly in conjunction with the rest of my skills, a drop of healing potion can bring feeling back into a leg, or close a wound to an internal organ. Should I dump an entire potion on a woman who is knocking on death's door after being mauled by a bear? Should I use every drop of potion I have to try and save a man with a spear through his heart? What happens to the next 10 or 20 people who need just a little more healing than my skills allow? Is saving one life more important than healing 20, so they don't have to live the rest of their lives maimed and in pain? Maybe you should stick to adventuring. Leave me to use my experience as a healer and my wisdom as an elder to choose how to most effectively help people. Adian's heart dropped at the pain he could see in the old healer's eyes. He waved his hands in an appeasing motion. I'm so sorry. That is a common saying among adventurers, but it was thoughtless of me to utter in your presence. Of course, you must use your limited resources as best you can. In my times in adventuring and at war, I have also had to weigh the risk and reward of saving a life, so I at least partially understand. The old woman shook her head. No, it is I who should be sorry. I know what you meant. I think I might just be a bit envious. I wish I had the funds to buy a potion every time it was needed. I understand your point. Money is useless if you are dead. Adian breathed a relieved sigh. Exactly. If you truly need a healing potion, I have more than enough money to purchase you I would be more than... Healer raised her hand to stop him. She smiled sadly. Keep your money, son. Use it to become an adventurer that not only helps individuals, but helps whole nations. If you can fulfill some of the potential I see in you, Neridni is thankful for the aid you have already given them. But this isn't your home. We can manage. Besides, I still have almost an entire potion in case of emergency. Adian wanted to respond, but he found he just couldn't find the right words. The healer pointed out the alchemist shop, which was only a few hundred paces away. Adian headed right to it after apologizing again to the healer and put in an order for a healing potion. Apparently, this particular alchemist didn't keep any in stock because they were purchased so infrequently and had a long but still limited shelf life. After leaving the shop with instructions to return the morning after next, Adian headed towards the town hall. As he walked down the packed dirt road, he found his mind wandering once again to the words of Healer Norley and the idea that they conveyed. Was it really ethically sound to allow someone to die in front of you when you had a potion that could potentially heal them? A large part of Adian thought that if he was put in the healer's shoes, he would feel a responsibility to put all of his effort into saving every life he could. If it took 2 potions to save the person in front of him today, then so be it. The next day, he would once again use all the tools he had available to try and save the lives put before him. This felt correct to him, and he thought that it resonated with the teachings of the Creator. However, he understood the logic of the healer, and he had a feeling that if he had lived the life she had lived and had cared for as many injured people as she had, he would have probably have a similar outlook. After all, even though he liked to forget it, Adian couldn't help but remember his time in the militia. He had chosen to retreat instead of pushing forward when that choice had meant leaving comrades behind. He had determined that the risk to him and his men was too great when considering the low likelihood of a successful rescue. No one had questioned his decision. No one except Adian himself, who still awoke in a cold sweat some nights from nightmares filled with the faces of those he had left behind. While he was still 100 or so paces from the town hall, Adian noticed Dre pulling a loaded cart down the street. The sight of the young man broke Adian free of his dark memories. He gave a wave, but Dre didn't seem to notice, so Adian walked over to him and asked, "Hey, Dre, how did class selection go? Get what you were hoping for?" Dre came to a sudden stop in the middle of the street, forcing those behind him to veer around him with angry mutters. The young man slowly looked up at Adian, and for the first time, he noticed the look on Dre's face. It was a mask of pure horror. Adian had seen men face down giant spider nests with less anxiety. "Dre, is everything okay?" Dre let out a small half snort, half sob, and then slowly moved his head till he was once again looking at the ground directly in front of his feet. He began to pull his cart again, leaving Adian alone in the center of the road, like a lone rock standing firm against a river current. Had he said something wrong last night? Or had Dre's class selection really been that terrible? Having seen Dre work under pressure, Adian had been sure he would be given some decent class options. But it wouldn't be the first time that someone Adian thought deserved a great class ended up as only a common laborer. It had been drilled into Adian's head at a young age that such scenarios came down to self-belief. The people this happened to tended to have very low self-esteem. They didn't think that anything they did was worthwhile. They didn't think they deserved any better than the worst. When people thought this way, even if their actions contradicted their thoughts, even if other people saw great potential in them, the class system, for some reason, seemed to believe the individual and gave them classes accordingly. Dre hadn't seemed like that kind of person, but it was impossible to truly know the inner texture of another's mind. Adian turned back towards the town hall and almost ran into a young woman who was hurrying in the same direction as Dre. "Oh, excuse me, Asia. Sorry about that. Do you know if Dre is okay? I tried to talk to him a moment ago and he didn't respond. Honestly, it looked like he was half dead, and his other half was scared out of his mind." Asia's frown deepened, and she gave an exhausted sigh. She kept her slightly bloodshot eyes focused on the road ahead as she replied, "He didn't sleep a wink last night, and I would know since I stayed up with him. That isn't the real issue, though. I wish I knew what was. I didn't even get the chance to wake him up last night. His breathing never settled into proper sleep. He had started to look pale almost immediately, which I thought might just be part of the class selection process. I started to get concerned after I noticed that he was sweating. I touched his hand to see if he was overheating, but it was as cold as ice. I was about to fetch his parents to see if they thought something was wrong when he woke up screaming the word no. It took me half the night to calm him down enough to get coherent sentences out of him. But even after he regained his words, he still refused to tell me what happened." Adian tried not to wince, but failed. "You think he wasn't given any options then?" "That's what I assumed at first, but I heard him mumbling something to himself about being tricked, so now I'm not so sure." She began to bounce anxiously on her toes. "Anyways, I'm trying to keep an eye on Dre. He's just so out of sorts. I just want to make sure that he stays safe and doesn't do anything stupid." Before Adian figured out how to reply, Asia was gone. He turned and watched her hurry after the cart that appeared to be moving at a pace slightly slower than a legless Gargan tortoise. Adian once again stood alone in the middle of the road. His mind raced, trying to figure out what scenario must have played out during Dre's class selection to put him into such a state. He didn't dwell on it, though. There was no way for him to figure out what had happened without Dre telling him. Hopefully, the boy would get out of his funk soon, and then Adian could talk with him. The encounter dampened his good mood. He had really expected that Dre would get a useful, if not great, class. The epiphany he had received that morning of what his next step should be depended on that, after all, didn't it? It wasn't like he could invite a common laborer onto his team, right? Adian turned again, making sure to be more aware of his surroundings, but there was no one to run into this time. So he continued along the surprisingly busy street until he arrived at the town hall. Strangely, half of the town council were standing in front of it. They looked expectantly down the path, in the opposite direction that Dre and Asio were traveling. Adian walked up to the nearest council member, a large man who was wearing a black leather apron. Mostly because of the council members present, the smith had angered him least the previous day. "What's going on?" Adian asked. The smith's gaze shifted from the road to look down at Adian.
"Oh, hi there. Field musician Adian, wasn't it?"
he said with a voice like a wagon wheel rolling through gravel. "Yes, I'm surprised you remembered. But anyways, are you all waiting for something?"
"Oh, yes. Someone, actually. I forgot that you were sent away before the decision was made. A silly choice in my estimations. Not sure why the mayor would send away the one eyewitness we had of the entire situation. But it isn't my call, you know. If I was mayor, I definitely would have had you stay. But Lord Kai comes from a different line of men. I find him less practical than someone like myself, who has a real job that requires hard work on the daily. You see?"
The smith rambled until Adian lost his patience and cut the man off. "Of course, I'm sure you're right," Adian said, not at all caring what the man had been trying to get at. The one thing the large man hadn't been doing was answering his question. "But what did you say you were all waiting for?"
Of course. Well, we decided we didn't have a strong enough fighting force here to deal with a threat as dangerous as what you told us of. So we decided to hire a score of men from a nearby militia. We sent a boy as soon as the decision was made, and he returned with the message that the men would be arriving this morning.
The smith replied as his eyes scoured the road ahead, like there was a bet on who could catch sight of them first. Adian tensed at the news. "And what militia did you contact?"
"Oh, the best one around, to be sure. It's Raven's militia. Have you heard of them?"
Adian let out an inaudible groan. The smith broke off his search to look at Adian.
"Oh, so you have history with them, do you?"
At least Adian had thought it had been inaudible. He sighed, and then said, "Yes, I was actually a member until only recently. I served for the better part of 2 years. I would have stayed if my moral beliefs hadn't clashed so often with my orders." Adian let out an amused snort. "Believe it or not, I reached the rank of squad leader in 2 years, even without any type of leadership abilities in my class. You wouldn't happen to know who was in charge of the group you hired, would you?"
"Actually, yes. I believe his name was Mucker? No, Ruckburb. No, it was shorter than—"
"Rucker? Captain Rucker?"
"That's it. The mayor heard he was the best, so he sent for him by name."
Adian tried to keep his face blank. The best? The only thing that Rucker was the best at was getting his subordinates killed, but at least if he was coming, that meant he would get to see his old team again. Marcia, Gavin, Olive, and Miena. It felt like a lifetime since he had last seen them. He hoped they were doing well. They probably hated him for the way that he had left. Adian let out a long sigh and then said, "I have dealt with the man before."
"Well, that should make things go smoothly. We'll need you to brief him and his men this afternoon, after they set up camp. The mayor has offered them a spot east of town on his pretty little property. It's probably just for extra protection it provides him, not that he needs it, with all of Neridany in between him and this potential dungeon. If he spent all day swinging a hammer instead of sitting around, he might not need a score of armed men outside his door to feel safe. Not that I think every leader has to be a warrior, but it sure would be nice if—"
Adian stopped listening as his thoughts spiraled. He walked away as the man droned on, obviously not even noticing Adian's absence. He looked up into the sky with a sour expression on his face. "Thanks for the restful day."